So Putin is in China and his agenda is crystal clear. He's out to build a new order with China, one that pushes back against the West and splits the world into two. This trip is interesting because there's now a deep understanding between Russia and China. They recognize they need each other and it's time to strategize against the US. President Xi told Putin that Russia-China ties should last for generations. Now is the time to consolidate the friendship between the two people, and it's all about countering US containment of both the Russian and Chinese economies. It's night and day when you compare Blinken's arrival to Putin's welcome. Blinken was greeted by the local mayor on the tarmac, but just watch the reception given to Putin by Beijing. It's on a whole different level. You have the red carpets, the military honor guards, the limousine. Basically, China rolled out all the stops for Putin. He was greeted by China's top female politician, Sheng Yiqing. So the symbolism is all there. And if this wasn't enough for you, China took it up a notch further. They literally gave Putin a cheer squad and his red carpets everywhere. It's obvious this meeting means a lot to the Chinese. It's important to note this came on the back of the Blinken and Yellen's visits. Those were warnings to Beijing against dealing with Russia. They want China to scale down their trade with Moscow. Then we have the recent tariffs from the US on Chinese imports. Biden has hit China with a flurry of taxes that's just meant to contain China's growth to slow down their economy. And as we've said, this won't stop. The US is even targeting Chinese cooking oil. That's insane. They are thinking of slapping higher levies on this import to protect the US soybean industry. Can you really believe this? How is this even possible? And it's quite crazy if you think about it. Sooner or later, everything from diapers to toys will have a tariff on them. As long as it's made in China, it's a threat to US national security. Beijing knows this won't stop. The great decoupling between the American economy and China has begun. The only way forward is to work with Russia. President Xi and Putin are going to strengthen each other's economy to flip the world order on its head. To Russia and China, this is now existential. We have to view both countries as one unified economic bloc. If Russia falls, China will be vulnerable, and vice versa. At the heart of this is the move away from the US dollar. The dollar, as we all know, is America's biggest economic weapon. It's the ultimate financial tool that can shape geopolitics. If the US doesn't like a country, they can block their access to the dollar system. And if things get extreme enough, Congress can freeze their sovereign assets as well. And that's why the faster China and Russia breaks away from the reserve currency, the better. And this is what Putin had to say about it.
Торговых потоков придало наше своевременное совместное решение обеспечить перевод двухсторонних расчетов в национальные валюты. Сегодня уже 90% всех платежей проводятся в рублях и юанях. Мы сейчас говорили о том, в узком составе, о том, по каким направлениям дальше будем развивать наши отношения. И все это в интересах как российской, так и китайской экономики.
In other words, Putin wants to further de-dollarize both the Chinese and Russian economies, put an end to dollar transactions completely when it comes to bilateral trade. It's now at 90%, why not make it 100%? When China buys commodities from Russia or when Moscow imports from Beijing, everything will be paid outside of the dollar in either rubles or the Chinese yuan. De-dollarization reduces reliance on the Western financial system. Putin confirms this in his follow-up statement. We can say our trade and investments are effectively safeguarded from the influence of third countries, and it's clear as day what he's referring to. He's talking about the US and their ability to influence a country's economy. In his recent trip to Ukraine, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken once again threaten to confiscate Russia's frozen assets. This will happen sooner or later. Our Congress has given us the power to seize Russia's assets in the US, and we intend to use it. He also confirmed that the G7 group is planning to unlock billions of dollars to teach Russia a lesson. And if you're China, you know anything can happen to you. It might be a trade war today, but it could be economic sanctions tomorrow. China as a whole has a lot of money in the US, both in the private and public sectors. There's always the fear of Joe Biden weaponizing the US economy against Beijing. The US currently holds $280 billion worth of Chinese company assets. It has grown tremendously over the past 15 years, from under 20 billion to nearly 300. And these are investments from private Chinese firms into the US. Farmland, real estate, factories, and office spaces. All this could be at risk of confiscation. If the US and China gets into a full-scale economic war or even a hot war, then all bets are off. Extracting these assets away from the US or any country for that matter isn't easy. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money to sell off your holdings, and it's likely you'll be dumping at fire sale prices, especially in today's economy. It goes without saying that the US is uninvestable for China. It's not just the high cost of production, US laws are increasingly hostile towards Chinese firms, plus, there's always the threat of confiscation looming around. It's simply not worth it anymore. We can expect foreign direct investment from China into the US to plunge further. They have no choice but to head elsewhere. But that's just on the private side. China is still horribly exposed to US dollar assets. China still holds $767 billion worth, and this is the lowest amount of holdings for over 2 decades. Beijing has been dumping a lot, reducing their exposure by over 100 billion over the past year. But make no mistake, their holdings are still tremendous. And if we add in Hong Kong, the total amount is nearly $1 trillion. China is slowly deleveraging their bonds because they don't want to suffer a loss. So instead of dumping everything off at once, Beijing is allowing a ton of bonds to mature without reinvesting. If we look at China's overall selling, the pattern is overwhelming. It's undeniable that the amount of Chinese holdings is dropping. When the '08 crisis struck, China saved the US by investing in a ton of US debt, and in the years ahead, they continued to finance the US government. At one point, they bought nearly $80 billion in a single month in 2014, and everyone was happy with the situation. There was still some free trade going on and tensions were still manageable. But look at the situation today. Since the war and sanctions started, China has been deleveraging hard. Their holdings of both treasuries and agency bonds are going down. They are selling off their dollar assets because of counterparty risk, the fear of confiscation. Even the agency bonds in yellow are being sold off. The bond yields there might be 1 or 2% higher. But if America sanctions you, what's the point? Your holdings are essentially worthless. China simply can't access them. Their value is effectively zero. It's not a surprise that Beijing is starting its great sell off. Even mainstream media today is getting worried about China walking away from dollar assets. Bloomberg is calling it diversification away from the US dollar. But for China, it's more about economic survival. It's about protecting their wealth earned from the decades of trade surplus. Your hard work, you want to protect the money earned from it. And that's why the share of gold in China's reserves is rising fast. It's the highest since 2015. It's not a coincidence, it's all by design. Beijing needs an asset that is free from counterparty risk and can't be debased by US money printing. And the only asset that makes sense is gold. For you and me, gold is all about capital protection to fight inflation over a long period of time. But for China, it's their survival instinct. Since the start of 2022, Beijing resumed their official buying. Their official gold holdings have increased from around 3% of total reserves to nearly 5%. And that's a big jump within 2 years. This is what they are telling us. They are probably understating it. If you're buying an asset, you want to buy things when prices are cheap. China won't declare their true holdings until it's time to show their hand. Getting rid of their US bonds and buying gold is an important step, but Beijing can't stop there. They need to build up their economy to an even bigger scale, to an enormous scale. China's biggest defense isn't really their military, but their economy. China's industries are world class, and that's why their exports are flooding the world. It's the same reason why the US started a trade war with China. The US will continue raising trade barriers to decouple China from the US market and the rest of the Western market as well. And that means President Xi has to build greater trade with Russia. If Russia prospers, so does Beijing. China's exports to Russia jumped tremendously in a single year. Exports increased by almost $40 billion from 2022 to last year. We are now well past the 110 billion mark. Trading with Russia is another avenue for China to push out their exports. While it's true that margins in the US might be higher, they could earn more, trade with Russia can grow more sustainably. It's quite obvious why China will continue working with the Russians to build up their economy. A richer Moscow means a stronger Chinese economy, and that protects it against Western sanctions and the coming trade war. In addition to that, China needs to shore up their own domestic economy. President Xi needs to get people in China to spend more and more. China's Q1 GDP came in at an impressive 5.3%, of which three quarters came directly from domestic consumption. So there's big potential there, and this is amid a property collapse, let's not forget that. So just imagine the internal growth once that is settled. And this is why we are seeing the Chinese government move to shore up the property collapse. If they can improve sentiment on the ground, it will help people spend again. And to make this happen, China is selling a ton of ultra long bonds to raise money for stimulus. Beijing will be raising around 1 trillion yuan or $140 billion, and this is a lot of funding. The timing is not a coincidence. They are raising the money to build infrastructure and even support the property market. This is a form of stimulus to boost consumer sentiment. The move alone could boost GDP by one whole percentage point, which is a lot considering the overall size of the Chinese economy. They simply can't wait anymore. The US is becoming more aggressive, so China is starting to move fast. If US China relations were stable, Xi Jinping will take his time, China will take their time to build back up their economy. But the timetable has to accelerate. They have to go further today. Regulators in China are discussing a plan to save the property market, and this includes getting the state to buy millions of unsold homes in the market to save the developers from collapse. China might direct the local governments to absorb the excess supply of homes. It's a form of bailout for sure, but Beijing doesn't really have a choice now. They must protect domestic consumption at all costs. And in the months ahead, the US could ramp up the trade war. It is not a guarantee but a high probability. This battle is far from over. China has to prepare. And the best preparation is to build a stronger domestic economy. Make the Chinese consumers strong and confident enough to spend so that if the sanctions really rain down on China, they can survive and thrive. And it's important we understand where things are going. We are looking at a total bifurcation, a splitting apart of the world economy. It's coming, in fact, it's already starting. We'll have the western half on one corner, which is essentially the G7 and friends, the US, Europe, and Japan working and trading together. And on the other spectrum, we'll have Russia, China, and the BRICS nations building up their own systems. And this will, of course, include payment systems and new forms of bilateral trade. The Russia China alliance will continue to grow, there's no doubt about it. The biggest nightmare of the West has been of their own making. They are the architects of their own demise. But let me know what you think. Will Russia and China fully de-dollarize? And will the US ramp up the trade war even further? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.